What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen has the audacity to sacrifice the rook on move 11 against Alexey Sarana. Now, this game took place in the 2023 World Blitz Championships, and it was just unbelievable. I mean, I don't know what Magnus Carlsen was smoking in this game, but whatever it was, it must have been the good stuff. Give me some of that. Now, in the game, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. He opens 1e4, and Alexey Sarana is a well-known Najdorf specialist in the Sicilian defense, so of course he responds 1c5, then d6. Now, for those who are not familiar, the Najdorf Sicilian is a variation of the open Sicilian. That's where white goes d4, black takes on d4, knight takes d4, and then we have the sequence of moves, knight f6, knight c3, and then finally a6. This last move, a6, is the defining move of the Najdorf. It is a very, very sharp variation of the open Sicilian. And Magnus Carlsen sometimes does play this opening. However, today he was not in the mood for that. Instead, he goes for an anti-Sicilian variation. He starts with knight c3. Now from here, black goes knight f6, and here is the big curveball of the opening. Magnus goes bishop to e2. Now, real fast, instead of bishop e2, if Magnus had gone for the move d4, then that would have transposed back to an open Sicilian and perhaps going straight to a Najdorf variation. Now, instead of that, bishop e2 on the board, and this move is super interesting. I mean, from here, Magnus retains the flexibility to go d4 in the future, transposing back to some sort of an open Sicilian. However, he doesn't have to do that. He can also go perhaps d3, castles, and then start a kingside attack in a closed Sicilian-style position. So overall, this move, bishop e2 from Magnus, very, very flexible, and in the game, it does seem to work out very well for him. Now from here, black has a wide variety of choices. In the game, he goes for the move a6. That is staying flexible, and if Magnus were to go d4, he could transpose back to a Najdorf immediately. However, in this position, black does have a number of other options. Real fast, he could go knight c6, trying to control the center. e5 is possible, locking down on d4 forever, and even g6, playing for a fee and shadow of the bishop on g7. So, point being here, black, he doesn't have to go for a6. He has a wide variety of options, but a6 on the board, this is a very natural move for Alexey Sarana. He's a Najdorf specialist, so maintaining that option to transpose back to a Najdorf makes a lot of sense. Now, from here, Magnus, he castles, and black, again, has a very big choice. Now, in the game, he goes for the move b5, gaining space on the queen side and preparing the idea of bishop b7 next, putting that bishop on the long diagonal and, of course, pressuring that e4 pawn. However, it turns out this was already a slight mistake. Instead, the best move here in this position is the idea of e5 clamping down on the center and preventing d4 permanently. Now, real fast, the real benefit of this move e5, had Magnus played it, is here, Magnus Carlsen's best move is actually bishop to c4. And we're transposing back to some sort of anti-Sveshnikov variation where typically white is going to go bishop c4 in one go. So in this line, the fact that white had to go bishop e2 and then bishop c4 can only be good for black, and already the computer is showing black has full equality in this position. But instead of that, the move b5 on the board, and what's the problem with this move? Well, it's pretty simple. Here, Magnus showing his idea of his opening. He goes back to some sort of weird open Sicilian with the move d4, and now after c takes, knight takes, we sort of reach a Najdorf-style position where Magnus has gone for bishop e2 and short castles, whereas black, on the other hand, has the move b5 in this position. And overall, b5 is kind of premature. I mean, from here, Magnus can go for ideas like bishop to f3 and then e5, trying to open up that long diagonal for the bishop. And there are just so many dangerous ideas for Magnus here. Now, in the game, Alexey goes bishop b7, shoring up that long diagonal. That is the best move. But here, Magnus still in control. Now, in the game, he goes bishop f3. Very solid move. Of course, that pawn on e4 was being attacked twice by the bishop and the knight. So Magnus needs to over-defend that pawn with the knight and the bishop. So overall, bishop f3, very solid move. However, there was an incredibly dangerous idea, that being the pawn sacrifice with the move knight to d5. Now, this move, knight to d5, is super complicated. I don't want to cover it too much. I mean, Magnus has three ways to win the pawn. Either knight takes e4, winning the pawn, or knight takes followed by bishop takes, winning the pawn, or even bishop takes followed by knight takes, winning the pawn. So again, there are tons of ideas here. Here's just one sample line to show you how dangerous this idea is for black. Here, if black takes with the knight, white takes back with the pawn, black takes with the bishop, but now white's already castled, black's king is stuck in the middle of the board, and that is going to spell disaster for the second player. Now for white, the best line is rook e1, getting that rook on the open e-file. Now black has to go e6, trying to go bishop e7, then short castles, but now bishop h5 from white. Already the threat is knight takes e6, and that pawn on f7 is pinned to the king by the bishop. Okay, black goes g6, blocking the threat. White retreats. Now we have a trade on f3. Black has to go rook a7, getting the rook out of the attack of the queen. But now already white can sacrifice the knight on e6, blowing open the position, and it is just a complete disaster for black. So again, that is just one sample line out of many. This idea knight d5, opening up the position and sacrificing the pawn is just so incredibly dangerous. But instead of that, bishop f3 on the board, not a bad move at all by Magnus. Now Alexey, knight b to d7, that is the best move. Now, if you're a beginner, you may be wondering, why did black go knight b to d7 instead of knight c6? Isn't the knight better placed on the c6 square, putting more pressure on the center? Well, it turns out in the Najdorf, that knight is often best placed on d7. From there, it does a great job of controlling those central squares e5 and c5, and it also keeps the c-file open for the rook on c8. So overall, knight d7, typically the best move in the Najdorf, although there are some exceptions where you do want the knight on the c6 square. Now, this is where things get super spicy. Magnus plays the move a4, trying to bust open the queen side. We can already see his idea in this position, that bishop on f3, pressuring the long diagonal, the rook trying to open up the a-file. Here, Magnus trying to play on the queen side. And now already things are super critical for black. He has to do some combination of the moves b4 and e5, trying to close down the center of the board. So for example, one idea is b4, then knight d5, then e5. The other idea is e5 immediately, and after knight b3, then going b4. Again, I don't want to cover these lines in too much detail. However, the big point is opening up the position here is just suicide for black. But that is what happens. He takes the pawn on a4. Alexey, what are you doing? Now, Magnus takes back, and Alexey finally tries to get his kingside development going with the idea of bishop e7, then short castles. However, here, Magnus, oh my goodness, rook b4 on the board, and the idea of this move is Magnus, he simply wants to sacrifice the rook for the bishop almost no matter what. Now, you may be wondering, Mike, can't he just defend the bishop with, I don't know, rook b8, rook a7, queen c8, queen c7, knight c5, any of these moves? I mean, isn't it just that easy to defend the bishop? And Magnus Carlsen's response is yes, it is that easy to defend the bishop, but it doesn't even matter. He's doing it anyway, no matter what. He is sacking the rook. All right, here's an overview of all the different ideas. If Alexey goes rook b8, Magnus sacks the rook. If Alexey goes rook a7, Magnus sacks the rook. If Alexey goes queen c7, that's right, he sacks the rook. What about queen c8? Doesn't matter, you sack the rook. And finally, if Alexey goes knight c5, as he did in the game, that's right, Alexey went knight c5 in the game, defending the bishop, it does not matter, Magnus sacks the rook. Okay, what the heck is the idea of this move? Why is it brilliant no matter what black does? Well, here's the idea. Black is going to take the rook on d7, knight takes b7, but then Magnus, here's the key idea, e5 with the double attack on the knight and the knight. And by the way, it didn't even matter if Alexey were to defend that bishop on b7 with the rook going to b8 or a7, or even the queen to c8 or c7. Regardless, you take the bishop, and then you go for the move e5 with the double attack on the knight and whatever piece is there on the b7 square. Okay, what happens from here? In the game, black takes the pawn on e5. Of course, he is defending that knight on f6. But that means the knight on b7 is now hanging, and the best move is simply bishop takes b7. But Magnus, I really don't know why he did this. Maybe he was just trying to kick dirt in his opponent's eyes. He goes for the move bishop to c6 check, hitting the check before taking the knight. Okay, what the heck is the point of this? Here, Alexey Sarana, knight d7, the best move, defending against the check. And on the one hand, the obvious move is going to be bishop takes b7. I mean, black hangs a knight, you take a knight, right? Well, Magnus Carlsen has a different idea in mind. In this position, he sacks the knight. Knight takes e6. Okay, what the heck is the idea of this? Okay, first of all, you are attacking the queen on d8. Black has to do something about this. He can't simply move the knight on b7. That would be suicide. And the only real move is taking the knight on e6 with the pawn. Real fast, for example, if black were to move the queen somewhere else, let's say queen c8, then Magnus jumps in with the queen to the d5 square, queen d5, and he has the double attack on the knight with the bishop and the queen, and he's also supporting his knight on e6. And that is just going to be suicide for black. There is no hope. Okay, so instead of that, of course, Alexey takes the knight on e6. He is no dummy. He's an experienced Najdorf expert. I mean, he knows how to deal with these knight sacrifices like this. These are super common in the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. But here's Magnus Carlsen's idea. First, before taking the knight on b7, he inserts the check on h5, queen h5 check. Now, of course, g6 is suicide because Magnus takes the pawn on the e5 square, hitting the rook, and the knight is pinned to the king, so knight takes e5 is simply not an option. Now, black, king e7, the only move to get the king out of trouble. Now, finally, Magnus takes the bishop on b7. Black goes rook b8, defending, and now the bishop on b7 is hanging. So, of course, Magnus Carlsen is going to defend the bishop, maybe go bishop f3, right? If you thought that, you thought wrong. Here, Magnus, real fast. He goes rook d1, inserting yet another threat. And by the way, technically, yes, bishop takes a6 was the best move, but Magnus is in no mood to play the best move. He wants to punch his opponent in the face with the move rook d1, and this move has a ridiculous idea behind it. Real fast, if Alexey Sarana took that bishop on b7 in this position, then Magnus has a finishing blow. He delivers the check on g5, and of course, the knight on d7 is pinned to the queen. So you can't go knight f6, then Magnus just takes the queen. That is no good. But how else is black going to block the check? And it turns out literally every square the king could go to is covered. The only way to block the check is knight f6, and then you take the queen, king takes, queen f3, with the double attack on the f6 square and the rook on b7, and that is just all she wrote. So, of course, way back here, move 18, rook takes b7 is just suicide. You cannot play that. Instead, queen c7 is the move. Now, of course, the idea behind queen c7 is simply getting the queen out of the way of the pin from the rook on d1. Now, from here, there are no good threats, so Magnus simply has to take the pawn on a6 with the bishop. Very good idea. Now, knight f6. And here's where Magnus starts to falter a little bit in this game. So far, our hero is just destroying Alexey Sarana with the rook sacrifice, with the follow-up knight sacrifice. However, Magnus is human, and this is a blitz game, and he plays the very slow idea of queen e2. Of course, his queen was being attacked by the knight, so this move does make a little bit of sense. However, instead of that, the best move was bishop to g5, simply continuing the attack and trying to bring all of his pieces into the game as fast as possible. But of course, instead of that, queen e2 on the board from Magnus. And now Alexey Sarana starts to fight back in the game. Okay, he starts king f7. That move may look a little bit strange, but it is clearing the way for the bishop on f8 to get back into the game on any of these squares here. Now Magnus, knight e4, centralizing the knight. Not a bad idea. Alexey takes, knight takes, queen takes, and bishop e7. And suddenly, Alexey is starting to get all of his pieces activated. The rook is entering the game. And it's important to note here, Alexey's actually up material in this position. He has the extra exchange. Of course, him having the extra rook compared to white's light squared bishop. Yes, white does have the better pawn structure, and he is up one pawn. And that does give Magnus the advantage here. However, Alexey, he has some pros to his position. And if Magnus is not able to exploit the weak position of black's king on f7, then the tides could very quickly turn in this game. Now Magnus, what does he do from here? He starts bishop d7, centralizing the queen and theoretically putting pressure on that h7 square. Now Alexey, rook b4, hitting the queen. Magnus, queen f3, hitting black's king. Bishop f6, defending. Now, surprisingly, that bishop is actually very well placed on the f6 square. Of course, it defends that e5 pawn. And how is Magnus going to make progress in this position? Now, theoretically, the best plan for Magnus is going to be pushing those queenside pawns. Of course, those are doubled pass pawns. Those are just incredibly strong. However, it's not so easy to get them moving in this position. So Magnus, c3, starting to play a little bit passive, honestly. Now, rook a4 from Alexey. The idea is he wants access to that a1 square with the rook, and that rook is going to be a menace. Okay, Magnus, bishop c2, again, a little passive. Rook a1, g3. Okay, Magnus won't have back rank mate threats. It's a good idea. However, again, Magnus playing a little bit slow here. Okay, Alexey, rook d8. The last piece enters the game. Magnus, rook e1. And from here, both sides kind of play some slow, improving moves, nothing too crazy. This is where Magnus says, I've had enough. I want to press. He goes for it on the king side with the move g4. What the heck am I looking at? I mean, doesn't this move just sacrifice a pawn on h4? Bishop takes h4. Well, the answer is yes, but Magnus has an idea. Don't worry. And by the way, this is a really cool puzzle. Go ahead and try and solve this puzzle right here if you like puzzles. I mean, it's pretty simple. I'm going to say you only deserve 2 Happy Meals if you can solve this, but it's a zinger. Okay, did you find it? The move here for Magnus is bishop to g5. He sacks the bishop. What's the idea? Well, black takes, and then Magnus takes the rook. Yes, of course, that was the idea of g4 all along, threatening g5. And if black takes on h4, then there is that threat, bishop g5 with check, and that check is the difference right now. Of course, that bishop blocks the check to the king. However, after bishop takes, that check is a possibility. Rook takes. Here, we have this really weird position where material is actually equal. Both sides have the minor piece, the bishop, the rook. They both have 4 pawns. However, in this position, Alexey Sarana, I guess in time trouble, he blunders with the move rook d2. Now, once again, we have a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to solve this one. It is pretty cool. Okay, did you find it? The idea here is Magnus goes rook a7. What's the threat? If black's king were to retreat, let's say king e8, then you jump in with the queen to the f7 square. Oh boy, is that bad. And of course, you cannot defend with the queen. Queen d7, you lose the queen. So he plays the only move, rook to d7. But then Magnus Carlsen plays the finishing move, bishop to c6. Yes, forking the rook and the queen. And there is simply no defense to this. No matter what you do, you are losing material as black. So in this position on move 36, Alexey Sarana resigns. So Magnus freaking Carlsen. Wow, what a game. Now, before you go, if you enjoyed this video, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. It should be showing up on your screen right now. And I will see you in the next video.